in terms of chapter, what came before chapter 2 and what's going to come next, chapter 4. Right? How does that all flow together? Oh, thank you. But yeah. All right. So before we get going too far, I want to sort of ask a little bit of a fun question. And you guys can raise your hand or respond however you want. But who in here has seen the movie The Princess Bride? Yeah, good. Okay, this is one of my very favorite movies. And it looks like we have some fans, so this is good. And, you know, it was one of those movies that my parents used to watch with me when I was sick, which those of you who've seen it know that's kind of the whole premise of the story. There's this little kid, he's sick, and his mom comes in one day and says, "Hey, your grandpa's here to see you." And the kid's like, "Oh, do I have to talk to him?" And she's like, "You'll be fine, you'll get over it." And by that point, he's in the room saying hello already and that sort of thing. And he gives him this book, right? Because he's sick and he thinks, he needs some sort of entertainment. And the kid's skeptical. He goes, "A book, right? Like he needs to be sold on this thing." And so he asks, "Is it any good?" Right? And the grandpa, for those of you who know, responds by saying, "Are you kidding? It's got fencing and fighting and chases and escapes and revenge and true love and all this sort of stuff." And he's trying to sell this book to his grandchild. And that's kind of how I feel about the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Right? There is so much stuff packed into just these two books. We kind of cover a wide swath of time, but there are points where the story really slows down, right? And you get a lot of information in just a very short amount of time, right? But Samuel's got murder, it's got intrigue, it's got battles, it's got all this sort of stuff. It's a very big story, narrative. 1 Samuel is kind of a volatile time for Israel, right? And an exciting time to be sure, right? Because new things are happening, but it's also kind of volatile. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But things are happening in their history as a nation that have never happened before, right? They're going to get their first king very shortly, as we'll read. But yeah, that was my goal with that sort of question there, is to sort of introduce 1 Samuel and get us excited to read. But another thing I want to point out at this point is, where do we find 1 Samuel in our Bibles? Right? It comes right after what book? Ruth. It comes right after Ruth. However, in pretty much all Hebrew Bibles, Old Testament's written in Hebrew, that's all that is. The book of Samuel does not come after Ruth. Ruth is actually placed towards the end of the canon. And I think that's kind of interesting, right? So in most Hebrew Bibles, you go straight from Judges to 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is really kind of interesting. And I think it kind of sets us up well for thinking about the story. What do we know about the time of the Judges? How would you kind of characterize that time?
Everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
Exactly. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
It's a bad.
That is an awful thing. Yeah, very scary. There are lots of people who kind of compare Judges to like the Wild West, and that's very much like what it's like. We have the Judges, and some of the Judges do really well, and they do great things for Israel. Some of the Judges don't do so well, and they're impulsive and volatile and scary, kind of like Samson. As a little kid, you think Samson's the greatest. But when you grow up, you think, well, he's done some interesting stuff that I don't know is always good. But I think this sort of sets us up to see where we are at with 1 Samuel a little bit better. Before, even after we get into the book of Samuel proper, we don't have any sort of central government, really, right? Israel's just kind of this loose collection of tribes at this point. Other than, they have no government other than God, right? Which is all well and good. But we know that Israel is going to ask for a king. And what is amazing is that God is going to give them that king, right? And Samuel is not going to like that. But that's going to be something that they ask for. And so in the book of Samuel, we're still very much living in that kind of time period of uncertainty and everyone doing what they think is best. And it's a scary time, I think, a little bit. And so it kind of, I think, helps us understand why the birth of Samuel and the end of Eli's priestly line is such a good thing, right? We're going to see we're going to talk more about Eli here in a second. His story is actually kind of interesting. All right, so the other thing I want to sort of keep track of as we get into the book of Samuel is some key themes, and we'll talk about these in a second. But just to run through the PowerPoint here, we got the setting, right? The time of the judges, the date, right? That this material covers roughly, give or take anywhere from 1000 to 965 BC or so. Authorship, many think it's Samuel himself. Ultimately, it's a little fuzzy. So that's that. Now for some key themes. I kind of want to track some things as we go through the book of 1 Samuel. And the first theme that I think is going to be really important, kind of the big one that is on our agenda, is kingship. Right? God is going to give this people what they ask for. They want to be like the other nations so bad, and God is going to say, all right, okay. And now Samuel, of course, gives them a warning speech. We'll get to that in chapter 8. And he's going to say, the king is going to be bad for you. He's going to take your stuff. He's going to take your women and do this and use your men as soldiers and whatnot. And he's going to, give them a real talking to. But they still want a king. And so God is going to give them what they ask for. This is probably the most obvious theme. And, from what we read in the narrative, it sounds like both God and Samuel don't love the idea of this, of the king, but they do give the people what they ask for. And so the theme of kingship is kind of really about exploring that decision, right? Does it work out in the end for Israel to have a king? Right? We see lots of kingly failures in 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. Right? Is this a good thing? And I think in some cases, the answer is no, right? We get a king like Saul who starts out really well, and then he doesn't do so well. And he starts making choices that are more and more self-centered and more paranoid, and that sort of thing. But in some cases, we'll get kings like David and Solomon who seem to do really well. So we'll keep track of that as we go. Another really big thing that I want to sort of keep track of is this theme of fathers and sons. Right? Fathers and sons are often at odds in the book of Samuel. We're going to see more specifically fathers really, they fail to teach their sons in 1 and 2 Samuel. Right? And it's going to begin like right here, chapter 1. Right? We're going to see Eli, and he's got sons that are like corrupt, and they're taking more than their priestly share, and they're bullying the people. And Eli's just kind of like, what are you going to do? Which it's not completely accurate, but that's kind of the sense that you get. He talks to them, but doesn't really fix the issue. And this continues, right? Even Samuel's sons are going to have issues. When Saul rises to power, there's a moment where he's not David's father, but he does invite David to come and marry his daughter. So they do become father-in-law and son-in-law. And he fails David on a number of occasions. Later, David himself is going to have a son who wrecks his whole kingdom, right? And there's going to be intra-family problems, and he's going to almost lose his kingdom over the way that he seems to fail at teaching his sons. Not to say that everything David does is bad, but that particular thing is something I think, need to look at. And then this we'll get into probably more next week, but kind of this reversal of fortunes, right? Chapter 2, Hannah's song is going to be all about this, right? Reversals of fate are the story of both Israel and Hannah, right? We'll talk a little bit more about this too, but Israel and Hannah are kind of they're kind of one in this story. Hannah is like this mini version of the nation of Israel. And she is barren. She can't have children. And Israel, in a sense, is in a similar state, right? They've just come out of the period of the Judges. It's a very uncertain, very scary time. And so her story functions like a mini version of what Israel, the nation, is going through. And it is her son who becomes the next great leader of Israel. So reversal of fortunes is going to be a big deal. The God who kills and brings to life, brings down to Sheol and raises up, right? This is all language from her poem in chapter 2. Let's see what else. Samuel becomes, in many ways, a transition figure, right? He's a judge still, but he's going to be the one that anoints the first king of this nation, and he's going to anoint the second king as well, right? He anoints both Saul and David, so he's kind of the middleman there, and the whole fate of the nation is profoundly changed by both Samuel and his deeds as the prophet and judge, right? Because he anoints David, things change for Israel. And then finally, this isn't so much a theme, but I wanted to mention before we get on to our last theme that something I want to look at as we go is each person in the narrative, right? Saul, for example. We're going to see Saul start out really good. And he's, taller than everyone else. He's an ideal candidate for kingship, right? He looks the part, he's handsome, and all that. But we're going to see Saul so slowly go like this. It's almost like a descent into madness, right? And he's throwing spears at David, and things do not go well for him, right? And eventually he ends up dead by the end of 1 Samuel. So the characterization, I guess, is what I'm getting at. We're going to kind of look at what each person displays and their character traits as we go along, right? And Saul is, I think, a good example of that. And then, of course, finally, there's going to be moments where 1 Samuel and people in 1 Samuel sort of anticipate, look forward to Jesus, right? The Messiah. Right? There are lots of points throughout 1 and 2 Samuel where David does something that looks an awful lot like Jesus, right? And it's not only David. There are other characters who kind of display this Messiah-like quality at different points, but primarily it is David. And of course, we know, 2 Samuel 7 is when we get the promise of God to David, through your line is going to come the Messiah, right? So we'll keep an eye on that as well. All right. So that's kind of our introduction for today. Just sort of lay the groundwork. I have a map here. I'm hoping that's big enough. And it's kind of really zoomed in on one kind of specific area of Israel. I wish it were, kind of a little bit bigger and you got to see more of the big picture. But this is kind of where stuff is going to happen today, right? This is kind of our world for now. We got Shiloh down towards the bottom here. which is where the temple is. And this is kind of our world. We're going to see Endor, right, eventually, towards the end of 1 Samuel. Ramoth Gilead is another important place here. But we'll get to all of that soon. So there's kind of our map of what's going on. Not sure if we covered this yet. Yeah. All right. So we'll go ahead and jump into the actual text of 1 Samuel. For whoever's comfortable with reading, I think we'll start on probably the right-hand side of the room. We'll just start with verses 1 and 2, and we'll kind of work our way back and around for whoever wants to read. Want to read for us, Mark?
Okay. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zoph, and Ephrathah. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children.
Okay, thank you. Another thing is I've tried to make our text as big as possible on here. I know that it's kind of hard to read, even for me. Sometimes I'm like trying to make sure I see correctly before I read, but I'll try and do my best to make sure that's as big as possible every time. But hopefully this is what we'll look like. We'll have maybe, it'll be mostly just the text up there for PowerPoints. But okay, we're into chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Ideally, we may would have covered chapters 1 and 2 together, but I thought some introduction would be helpful. So, who are we introduced to in these very first few verses? Hannah. Elkanah, her husband. Peninnah. Good old Peninnah, right? These are our main cast right now. And Elkanah is kind of the first person mentioned, right? He's the male head of the household. That's kind of expected. But he only gets the attention for about a verse, right? He's in the story, but he's like not really the focal point. He's just kind of there, as we'll see. But we're going to have the rug kind of pulled out from under us here, right? In many other biblical narratives, we're introduced to a man, right? And then the story goes on to focus on him. I'm thinking of stories like Job, right? Once upon a time there was a man. Not once upon a time, but We're introduced to Job, the man, and then it goes on to tell his story. Or Abraham, right? In Genesis chapter 12. But in the coming verses, we're going to see that it's actually Hannah that receives the bulk of the attention. And I think that's really interesting. The name Hannah actually means favored one, which is really interesting. It introduces a bit of irony here at the beginning of the book. Since she is the favored one, really. Her name means that, and her husband loves her. And he gives her a double portion. But it's actually her womb that's the one that's closed. And we're also introduced to the main problem that drives this first part of the chapter. Right? What's the problem here? Yep. I wasn't expecting that, but amen. Yes. Okay. Yes. Well, I guess you could say, that is a big problem. But the big one is barrenness, right? One wife can have children, one wife cannot, right? And this is a big problem in their day. And don't get me wrong, it's a big problem today, this kind of thing. Infertility and that sort of stuff is terrible, it's awful. But there are a couple things I think to consider when talking about childbirth and infertility in an ancient context like this one. Right? Socially, if you were unable to have children, you are looked at as the outcast. Right? You're second best, you're not as useful. Right? in a situation like she's in, where the husband has more than one wife, obviously Elkanah seems like a righteous man because he doesn't seem to want to do this, but there may have been the temptation to say, okay, you're not bearing me children. You're out of here. I have other wives who can bear me children. That wasn't a strange reality for them. Not that that's good, but that may have been a temptation for them. So you're an outcast if you're in this situation. All right. On top of that, right, they hadn't quite invented Social Security yet. So who's responsible of taking care of you when you get into old age?
Your children.
Your children, right? They're the ones who take care of you, and you all kind of live together. That's how they organize themselves. They are your Social Security in a very real sense. And so most of the time, this issue is literally one of life or death. Right? If you don't have children, if you're not able to produce children, it's harder to get things done around the house. And most of these people are subsistence level farmers, and so that becomes a struggle when you don't have as many hands. And again, when you get old, there's not enough people to take care of you and that sort of thing. So Hannah's problem is both, a very emotional one, but also a very practical one. Right? This goes beyond just, I really wish I could have a child. Though it is that as well. So that's verses 1 and 2. We're introduced to our main people here and then the problem. All right, let's look at verses 3 through 8. Whoever wants to read next is kind of going down.
Now this man used to go up year by year from the city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons and daughters.
Yeah.
But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?
Very good. Okay, so we're kind of back to Jeremy's comment here. Part of the problem is more than one wife. And just as a side note, I love to see people's reactions to this last, Elkanah's effort to sort of comfort Hannah, right? He's
Clueless.
Yes, he's a little bit clumsy. Best case scenario. So I think that's always a humorous moment. But yeah, this section sort of fleshes out the problem that we're introduced to in verses 1 and 2. Which brings us back to this thing that we introduced earlier. Hannah is kind of this representative, if you will, of Israel as a whole. Right? She's kind of like a mini version of the whole nation right now. They're both enduring kind of a long and difficult period of waiting and confusion. Right? She hasn't been able to have children. She really wants children. Israel needs some sort of leadership, right? Because the leadership they have now is failing. And Hannah so desperately wants this child, but we find out that she is being mocked by her adversary. Right? And that's kind of an unusual word. The word adversary here is like, I think you'll find it in military context, right? It's not like the normal word for someone you don't like, right? This describes Peninnah as an adversary, which I think is interesting. But we're also going to find out that Israel is oppressed in some way, right? The Philistines we're going to be introduced to very shortly. They're a constant thorn in Israel's side, right? Constantly. And the opening chapters of Samuel sort of show how God reshapes and interrupts Israel's history for the sake of a new king, right? New leadership and a coming kingdom, right? From which eventually the Messiah will come. God has a purpose for all that he does with Israel. We're going to see that very shortly. And, we maybe don't have to say this, but Israel isn't only physically oppressed, right, by the Philistines. From the book of Judges, we know that Israel is also kind of a lawless place right now. And everyone does what is right in their own eyes. And it's a time of moral chaos a little bit. Right, we can see this from stories like the Levite and his concubine in Judges 19. It's a terrible, terrible story. And so Israel, whether they're sort of conscious of this or not, is already in many ways kind of looking for something, right? They don't have good leadership right now. They need someone who will rule righteously, who will protect, who will kind of gather, who will sort of legitimate Israel as a nation. However, the narrative, we're introduced to Samuel, and in our Bibles, this comes right off the book of Judges, or Ruth, excuse me. But the story doesn't rush to David so quickly. Right? We have to wait a while till we get to David, the first really great king. Right? So we sort of accompany Israel through this period of waiting and confusion, right? As we make our way towards David, the first great king. From the way 1 Samuel starts, like we've said, it's kind of bleak. It kind of looks like there's no real plan for the future in place. We're not really sure what we're doing. And there are a lot of Bible stories that begin like this, right? I'm thinking of Genesis 22, where the first thing God comes and asks Abraham to do is give his son back that he's gifted to Abraham. Right? And he must have been confused and in anguish as he was making that decision to go ahead and go do that. I'm thinking also of the Exodus, right? It begins in the drudgery of slavery, right? And God hears the Israelites groan to him in their bondage, and he decides to enter into that situation and create this new people for himself. Right? The story of Jesus' birth begins this way, right? The murder of all those newborns. And he is born under the shadow of the rule of Herod. And they have to leave almost immediately to go to Egypt, as we read in Matthew's gospel. Right? So I guess the point here is that there's sort of a biblical precedent for things getting a little bit worse before they get better. Or at least I think that's what we see in this opening chapter of 1 Samuel. So yeah, that's where we're at there. Let's move on to verses 9 through 11. Yeah.
Going back to that about Elkanah saying that, am I not better with 10 sons? At first it seems he thinks highly of himself, but on the other hand, he is giving her double portions and really providing for her. So in a sense, he's saying, am I not taking care of you?
Yeah.
Like 10 sons would. And so, anyway, that's something.
No, I think that's legitimate too. We read it first, and it's kind of funny. We're kind of taken aback at like, oh, okay, you're not really helping. But he has made an effort, right, to provide this woman, this barren woman, with a double portion, right, that wouldn't maybe normally have been hers. But yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, he does make an effort at least. All right, so whoever wants to read next, verses 9 through 11.
After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, and remember me, and not forget your servant, I will give to your servant a son. Then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head.
All right, thank you. All right, so what do we see that's different now? Is there anything that sort of pops out at you?
Hannah kind of saying, forget this. I'm going to take care of this myself.
Yes. Hannah moves from being kind of just this passive figure to, I'm going to go do something about this, right? From passivity to activity. Right? She's not just going to sit back and take it, if you will. Well, yeah, I like the way you put that. It's exactly what I was looking for. She rises to go bring this problem before God. right? And through the opening story of 1 Samuel, what did I need to write there? Oh, we're sort of, we kind of go with Hannah as she goes from being inactive to deciding to do something about it, right? There's this hopeless situation, and she decides to go act as opposed to doing nothing. And really, I guess you could say that this is the kind of situation out of which God likes to work best, if you will, right? He's taken this no-name Israelite woman, and He has chosen her to be the means through which the fortunes of Israel are going to be reversed. Right? Her son is going to be the one that leads the way, right? Like she's going to soon sing about. I think one of the most beautiful things we learn about God here, one scholar said this, is about the Lord's transformative power, which creates a historical possibility where none existed before. Right? So it didn't look like the story was going anywhere. It was kind of hopeless. Hannah is barren. But through her initiative, God's going to actually respond and say, yes, I'm going to give you a child, as we'll see. Yeah.
Just thinking about the vow itself, it's really a self-sacrificing vow in a sense. She's seeking a child, but she's going to get the child right back to God.
Yeah.
So it does tell us something about what the motivation of having a child was. And if it was just a provision in her old age, make any sense. There's something about having a child and dedicating the child, raising the child to the God-fearing person.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's really important because we can kind of, at least I've kind of read this section of the story before. As, maybe Hannah's trying to barter with God in some ways, right? If you give me this, I'll give you that. And we don't, that kind of makes me nervous, when I think about it like that, I'm like, ooh, I don't think that we're supposed to, that should be our attitude, right? And, you can kind of almost read it that way, but I think your comment makes it clear that that's not what's going on, right? Hannah is going to give this child right back to God. Yeah.
In verses 1 and 2, we see that this story begins in the tribe of Ephraim, which is noted for being, it's famous for going its own way. It basically left Israel to the Gentiles, which makes that part of the context of this whole story.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. I'd actually not come across that, but that's a good point. Yeah.
Another thing I wonder about, is, she can't have a child, and yet she wants a child, and she's going to turn around and give it to the Lord. So, in a sense, she wants to stop that Penina from being her adversary constantly, aggravating her about it. But really, what is her motivation? It's more than one.
Right.
There's Penina on one hand. She can't have a child. She wants to have a child. Yeah. She's not going to raise that child. She's going to give it to the Lord. So
right.
We wonder also about all her motives.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that works. I think you and Jeremy are pointing out something similar there. I think that's really important. She's not using this child as a bartering chip. She really wants to have this child, and she says, I'm going to give him back, right? She's going to surrender this child she wanted so bad back to God. So, yeah. Let's move on to verses 12 through 18. We'll have our next reader.
She continued praying before the Lord. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli took her to be a drunkard. And Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from me. And Hannah answered, No, my Lord. I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul for the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless man. For all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace. The God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. And the woman went her way naked, and her face was no longer sad.
All right. I don't have a whole lot to say about this section, but I do think something large is worth pointing out here, and that is Eli. What does he think Hannah's doing? He thinks she's drunk, right? She's pouring out her heart here to the Lord at the entrance to the temple, and he thinks she's drunk. So I don't know, maybe this is more ambiguous than I'm kind of choosing to see it, but to me this, he's supposed to be, I guess, one of the more spiritually adept leaders in Israel, right? He's a priest. And he can't tell the difference between the woman who's like pouring out her heart in mourning and request to God and someone who's drunk. So what does that tell us about our leadership here? But I guess you could see it from other ways as well, too.
Well, I think this teaches us an important lesson, too. As Christians, we're often seen as being judgmental people. And I think this should teach us that we should give people the benefit of the doubt before we judge them.
Yeah, but he is also quick to jump to that, too. Right? He didn't go inspect. He just kind of said, get out of here, you drunk. And then she's got to say, no, I'm not drunk. I'm going through some things here.
Ethan, we see her response in verse 16, do not regard your servant as worthless.
Yeah.
She recognized that he saw her as being worthless, and yet she does have that, just to follow up on what Gabe was saying. And then in the very last verse, I thought was very interesting. As she left, she asked him, let your servant find favor in your eyes. Yeah, that is a very kind way of saying you're completely wrong. And ask for them to think of you in a completely different light.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see that in Israel's side. Israel is seen by the world as worthless. They have no economy. They have no leadership. They have no. They're a band of sheep herders, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And they came out of Egypt. What was their job in Egypt? Shepherds.
Yeah.
Which was looked down upon by the Egyptians. And so this representation, as you said, is asking for favor in sight of everybody else.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. The boldness of Hannah to say, maybe I'm not worthless. Even though I'm barren, this isn't accurate. But yeah, and then the way that Israel is also kind of shown through all of this is really interesting. But yeah, that's a great point. We're going to kind of skip over verses 19 through 23, which is just the Hannah and Elkanah go back to their home, and the Lord remembers her, and she conceives, and she actually does bear this son, and then it's kind of the preparations for going back to do as she said she would. And Elkanah kind of says, or she says, once the child is weaned, I'll bring him up, and her husband is like, okay, do whatever you think is good there. So we'll pick up in verses 24. It says on the slide 27, I caught this last night. We'll read through verse 28 from reader.
When she weaned him, she took him up with her, along with the 3-year-old boy, ephah of flour and a skin of wine, and she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to
said, "But my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who is standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I pray, and the Lord has granted me the petition that I made to him. Therefore I have led him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is led to the Lord. We worship the Lord."
Okay, thank you. So this is kind of our final chunk of chapter 1. She brings the child back just as she said she would. I think obviously kind of one of the main points of verses 19 through 28, that whole chunk there is, God's faithfulness toward Hannah, right? And by extension, his faithfulness to the whole nation of Israel, who's going to benefit from this child. I can see we have people coming out here, so we won't spend a whole lot of time on this. Let's skip to our questions and kind of round us out with that. What words do we notice being repeated? I will say that this isn't going to be super important for every chapter that we cover, but sometimes, when we see a cluster of words being repeated, that's a good clue that it's kind of pointing us towards the point that the chapter wants to get across.
Well, Mark's not in here, so I'll give you what I think he was saying. He said the theme of prayer was good.
Yeah.
And the word I put was Lord.
Yeah. Prayer is a good one, right? Hannah is quick to go to God in prayer.
The yearly sacrifice and worship, it's like they went every year.
Yes, this is something. Yeah, this is something habitual that the family does. So yeah.
The link to the Lord thing, she just keeps saying that. And it's kind of...
Yeah, that's another one that I picked up on. One that isn't maybe so obvious is the words to ask, right? Let me see. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me this petition, right? Samuel's name is actually kind of a play on words. Samuel's name is very closely related to the word for asking in Hebrew. And so she names him Samuel to sort of say, he's the one I asked for and you've given him to me. So there's that as well. There's lots of other questions that we could have gotten to. Maybe we'll cover some more of those next week. We'll make some more time for those. My goal is to do a little bit better job of time management, so we do get more of the questions toward the end. But as always, I'm going to end it by saying, if you guys have questions, concerns, comments, I'm open ears. Let me know what you guys think and what you'd like to see focused on, and we will do our best to spend time there. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.